The Prisoner of Zenda. Chapter 2. It was a very strange feeling for me to be standing in the forest in the middle of Mauritania in front of a person who looked exactly the same as me. For a few minutes, the future king of Mauritania and I stood looking at each other in silence. Then I bowed to him, and he finally spoke. "Colonel Fritz, who is this gentleman?" I was about to answer when Colonel Sabt stepped forward and spoke quietly to the king. As the colonel talked, the king listened patiently, staring at me now and then. While they were talking, I examined him carefully. He certainly looked very like me. Although there were some differences, his mouth was perhaps less wide and my face was a little thinner. But in most ways, we were identical. Colonel Sabt stopped talking and the king suddenly began to laugh loudly. Then he stepped up to me, still laughing, and said, "It's good to meet you, cousin. You must forgive me if I seemed surprised, as it's not every day that you see your double." "I hope you are not angry," I said. "Whether I like it or not, you can't help looking like me." "No, I'll happily help you. Where are you traveling?" "To Strelso, sir. To the coronation." The king looked at the two other men and smiled. "What would my brother Michael think if he saw us two together?" he cried. "But sir," said Fritz von Tallenheim, "I don't think it would be a good idea for Mr. Rossendale to visit Strelsa now." "Really? What do you think?" the king asked Colonel Sabt. "I agree. He mustn't go," said the older soldier. "Don't worry, sir. I understand the problem," I said. "I leave Mauritania today." "You don't need to go now," said the king. "Please, first you must eat with me tonight. You don't meet a new cousin every day." "Remember, sir, that we have an early start tomorrow," said Colonel Sapp. "We can still eat well," said the king, "and good food is more important than sleep." "Now, Mr. Rossendale, what's your first name?" "The same as yours," I answered, bowing again. "Come then, cousin Rudolph. I don't have a house here, but I am staying in the place my brother Michael uses for hunting. It's not the palace that I'm used to, but it will do for a few days." So I walked with the king for half an hour through the forest, talking happily, until we reached a small wooden hunting lodge between the trees. The king's personal servant came out to meet us. The other servant was the mother of Johan, the man who I had met earlier at the inn. "Is dinner ready yet, Yusuf?" the king asked the servant. The servant said it was, and showed us into a dining room where a table had been laid out with generous amounts of food. After my walk I was hungry, so I ate a lot, and the food was delicious. But I noticed that Colonel Sapt and Fritz von Tallenheim didn't want to eat much because of the events the next day. "The colonel and I have to leave here at 6 tomorrow morning," Fritz explained. "We ride to Zenda and return with a guard of soldiers to take the king to the station." "It's very good of my brother to let me use his guard," said the king. "But Rudolph, forget these two men. We don't need to get up early. So, eat some more, cousin." We continued to eat, and Yusuf continued to bring in more food. "The Duke said I was to give you this at the end of your meal," said the servant, putting some cakes in front of us. "Well done, Michael. He knows me well," said the king happily. And he ate the cakes hungrily, as if they were the first thing he had eaten all day. I ate one of the cakes, But I had really eaten enough. And when the king seemed to have finally finished eating, I asked to go to bed. That's all I remember of that night. The next thing I remember, I woke up suddenly, covered in water. I looked up and saw Colonel Sapp standing in front of me with Fritz von Tallenheim next to him. That wasn't funny, I said, when I realized that the colonel had thrown water over me, and nothing else would wake you up. It's 5 o'clock, said Sapp. 5 o'clock, but it's early and... Rassendel, said Fritz in a worried voice, you must come and look at this. He took my arm and led me to the next room. The king was lying on the floor. His face was red and he was breathing heavily. We've been trying to wake him up for half an hour, but we can't, explained Fritz. I bent down and felt his pulse, which was weak and slow. It must have been those cakes that he ate last night. Do you think he was poisoned? I asked. We don't know, said Sapp. We must get a doctor. There is no doctor for 15 kilometers, and even 1,000 doctors won't make him better today, said Fritz. But what about the coronation? I cried. We must tell the people of Mauritania that he's ill, said Fritz. If he's not crowned today, I don't think he will ever be king, said Sapp. But why? I asked. The whole country is waiting for him today. Most of the army is waiting too, with Duke Michael leading it. They want to be happy, said Sapp. We must tell everyone what's happened and make the most of it, said Fritz, getting up to leave. Sapp stopped him. Do you think that he was poisoned? He asked me. Yes, I do, I answered. Then who did it? It must have been Duke Michael, Fritz said angrily. Yes, he did this so that his brother cannot be crowned, continued Sapp. You don't know what the Duke is like, do you, Rassendel? If Rudolf doesn't become king, Duke Michael will take the crown. We all sat in silence while we thought about what we could do. Then Sapp suddenly stood up. I have an idea. It was lucky that we met you yesterday, he said excitedly, looking at me, because you can go to Strelso to be crowned. Me? That's impossible. I laughed. People would realize that I am not the king, and don't forget that I am English. It would be easy to forget that, said Fritz, because your German is perfect, and if we dress you in different clothes, no one will know. If you don't go to Strelso, Duke Michael will be king tonight, and the king will either be dead or in prison, said Sapp. I understand what you are saying, but the king would never forgive me if Our country needs this, cried Sapp. Standing up, I walked round the room in silence. The clock ticked 60 times, then 70, 80. I looked at the poor king lying on the floor and realized I had no choice. Sapp clearly read my expression, because he smiled even before I said quietly, Very well, I'll go. We won't wait for Michael's guards, but leave for Strelso at once, said Sapp. We can hide the king in the cellar. So when the guards arrive, they will think no one is here, said Sapp. What if they search the building? Asked Fritz. Yusuf will say the hunting lodge is empty, said Sapp. This is our only chance. How will we get the king to Strelso? I asked. Tonight, we sleep in the palace, said Sapp. As soon as we are alone in the king's bedroom, you and I will leave and come back here on our horses. Fritz can stay and guard the king's bedroom in the palace, and I will tell Yusuf to get the king ready for the journey back. The king will then return to the palace with me in the dark. Meanwhile, you will ride as fast as you can to the border and try to leave the country before it's light. Do we all agree on this plan? I agree, I said. It's a good plan, said Fritz. Sapp and Fritz picked up the king and began to carry him out of the room. But we realized we were being watched by Johan's mother, who looked at us with a strange expression before walking off. "I think she heard us," said Sam. "After we have moved the king, I'll speak to her." Meanwhile, Yusuf began to dress me in some of the king's clothes. When Fritz returned, he looked at me and said, "You know, I think we can do it." "What happened to Johan's mother?" I asked. "She's locked in the cellar with the king," said Fritz. "Yusuf will let her out later, after Michael's gone. But I'm sure when they find out that the king is not here, Michael will realize we know about his plan." "Let's go," said Sam, returning into the room. "Is all safe here?" asked Fritz. "No, nothing is safe anywhere. But we must do our best," answered Sam. We were now all in uniforms and set off on horses. It was a cool morning, and Sept immediately began to tell me the history of the king's life, of his family, likes, interests, weaknesses, friends, and servants. He told me how I should behave in the palace, and said he would always be at my side to tell me who the people were that I met. Soon we reached the station. Fritz told the surprised-looking station master that the king had changed his plans, and we got on the train to the capital. I looked at my watch, or I should say the king's watch, and asked Fritz if he thought Duke Michael had found the king. "I hope not," said Fritz. After a short time, we passed the towers and buildings of the capital, and I could see we were near the station. "How are you feeling?" asked Sept. "Nervous," I replied. "I'm not made of stone, you know." "You will be fine. But we are an hour earlier than they expect, so there will be no one to meet us. We must send word to the palace. So meanwhile, I will have some breakfast," I cried. "The king is hungry." Sept smiled at me, then took my hand. "Let's hope we are all alive tonight." The train stopped, and I breathed deeply as we stepped out onto the station at Strelso. A moment later, and everything was suddenly busy. Men ran up to us, then ran away again. Soldiers rode off on horses. Other men showed me to the station restaurant. As I ate my breakfast, I could hear music and the people cheering, "God save the king!" in preparation for the coronation. "God save both kings," said Sept. When we left the restaurant, we saw that a group of soldiers had arrived to welcome us. It was led by a tall man whose jacket was covered in medals. "That is Marshal Strakench," said Sept, so that I knew who he was, a very important person in the army. The marshal greeted me and said he was sorry that Duke Michael couldn't meet us at the station, but that he would see me shortly. I answered as politely and formally as I could, and he began to feel less nervous when no one noticed that I'm not the real king. But I saw that Fritz was still very nervous when he shook the marshal's hand. The soldiers led us out of the station, where we got onto horses that were waiting outside. I began to ride through the capital with the marshal on my right and Sept on my left. As we were riding, I saw that the city was partly old and partly new. There were wide modern streets where the rich people lived in big houses. There were the people. These were the people who had always lived well under the king's father, and who would support the new king because they knew that nothing would change. But behind the modern streets was a very different area that made up the old town. Here, thousands of people were crowded into tiny houses. which were old and hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter. These narrow streets were where the city's many poor people lived, and these people didn't want things to stay the same. For that reason, they didn't like the king and supported Duke Michael, who told them he wanted things to be different and gave them hope for a better future. I knew that this area wouldn't be very safe for me, the king. We continued towards a great square where the palace stood. There were colored flags and colorful ribbons everywhere, and the people lined the streets clapping and cheering. I waved to them as we passed, and people threw flowers down from balconies above me. One flower fell on my horse, so I picked it up and stuck it onto my coat. Seeing me do this, the marshal looked at me, but I couldn't tell from his expression whether he was happy or angry. Nevertheless, I smiled happily at the marshal. I have written happily, but that is really how I felt. The truth is, at that moment, I really believed that I was actually the king. I looked up and laughed, delighted to see so much color and so many happy faces. Then I looked again in surprise. There on a balcony above me was the proud smile of the traveler on the train, Antoinette de Maubin. As she stared at me, her expression changed. Surely she knew who I was. Surely she would call out, "That's not the real king." Thank you.